Little girl shamed for simple lunch, but a millionaire CEO defended her. The air inside the cafeteria was thick with the smell of fries, pizza, and warm bread. Chairs scraped against the tiled floor as students hurried to join their friends. Laughter bounced from table to table like small bursts of fireworks. In one corner, away from the noise, sat Emily, her back slightly hunched. Her small lunchbox rested in front of her, the paint on its edges chipped from years of use. She placed it gently on the table as though afraid it might break. Slowly, she unlatched the lid, her fingers trembling just a little. Inside lay 2 slices of plain bread, neatly stacked. Beside them, a small bottle of water, still cool from the morning. She glanced around to see if anyone was watching. Most kids were too busy unwrapping their colorful lunches. Some had sandwiches overflowing with cheese and vegetables. Others bit into steaming slices of pepperoni pizza. The chatter around her made her own corner feel even quieter. Emily tore off a small piece of bread and placed it in her mouth. She chewed slowly, as if trying to make it last longer. Her eyes stayed low, focused on the pattern of the table's surface. The hum of voices grew louder in her ears. She told herself to blend in, to disappear. Just eat. Don't look up. Don't attract attention. But the cafeteria was not kind to quiet moments. A burst of laughter erupted from a nearby table. Emily's head instinctively dipped lower. The sound of sneakers squeaking came closer. 3 boys walked past her table, their trays piled with food. They slowed down as they noticed her lunchbox. One of them smirked, nudging the boy next to him. "That's all you eat? Bread and water?" the tallest one asked. His voice carried easily over the noise, drawing glances from nearby students. Emily froze mid-bite, her cheeks heating. She didn't answer, hoping they would just walk away. The shortest boy tilted his head, pretending to squint at her lunch. "What are you, in prison?" he said, grinning at his friends. They all laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. Emily's fingers tightened around her bread. The bite in her mouth suddenly felt dry. She swallowed quickly, wishing the moment would end. She had learned long ago that defending herself only brought more mockery. Her silence was her shield, though a fragile one. The boys lingered for a few more seconds, as if waiting for her to react. When she didn't, they shrugged and walked away. Their laughter trailed behind them like an unwanted echo. Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She looked down at her bread again, trying to pretend it hadn't happened. Around her, life in the cafeteria carried on. Someone dropped a fork, the clatter loud against the floor. A group of girls squealed over a shared joke at the far end. Emily took another bite, this time smaller. Her stomach growled, but her appetite felt faint. She reached for her water bottle, unscrewing the cap slowly. The cool water slid down her throat, washing away the dryness. She kept her gaze fixed on the table, tracing invisible shapes with her finger. She thought about the mornings when her mother packed her lunch. Always the same. 2 slices of bread, sometimes a little butter, but not today. Her mother's tired hands had wrapped the bread in wax paper. Emily could almost feel the warmth of those hands in her memory. The smell of other students' lunches teased her senses. Crispy fries dipped in ketchup. Melted cheese stretching from a slice of pizza. A sweet smell of chocolate cake from a birthday celebration 2 tables over. She told herself not to stare. Instead, she folded her wax paper neatly beside the lunchbox. She liked keeping things tidy. It made her feel a little more in control. Another burst of laughter erupted somewhere behind her. She tensed, worried it was about her again. But no one came over this time. The minutes felt slow, dragging like heavy steps. She kept counting the tiles on the wall to distract herself. Her bread tasted the same as always, plain, familiar, and safe. She took another sip of water, letting the cap click softly back into place. She adjusted her posture, sitting straighter for a moment. Then she remembered where she was and leaned forward again. The cafeteria clock ticked above the exit doors. She watched the second hand move in tiny, deliberate steps. Lunch period would be over soon, and she could return to the quiet of the classroom. She preferred the quiet. No stares, no comments, no laughter at her expense. But here, in the middle of all this noise, she felt like an island in the sea. She took her final bite of bread, slow and careful. With a small sigh, she closed her lunchbox, ready to wait out the rest of lunch. The voices around her blurred into background noise, and she sat in her corner, invisible once more. The next morning, Emily walked into school with her backpack hanging lower than usual. She kept her eyes on the floor, hoping to blend into the river of students moving down the hallway. But whispers began almost immediately, like a faint breeze that carried her name. Some students covered their mouths, pretending to hide their laughter. Others didn't bother hiding it at all. By the time she reached her classroom, she could already feel the weight of eyes on her back. At recess, she stood near the fence while the other kids played in groups. From across the playground, she heard a voice call out, "Hey, got any bread?" followed by loud giggles. A group of boys mimed drinking from invisible bottles, tilting their heads back in exaggerated motions. Her stomach twisted, and she gripped the straps of her backpack tighter. She tried to ignore them, but the sound of their laughter dug deep. Even the girls she sometimes sat with at art class were now watching her with curious smirks. By lunchtime, the whispers had grown bolder. Every step she took in the cafeteria felt like walking through a tunnel of judgment. She sat at the same corner table, but the air around her felt heavier. She could hear the mocking voices from a table behind her. One boy said, "Don't drop the soap, prisoner," and the others howled with laughter. Her hands shook as she unwrapped her bread. The noise seemed to swell in the room, pressing against her like a wave she couldn't escape. She chewed in silence, feeling the burn in her cheeks. The worst part wasn't the laughter. It was the way no one told them to stop. The teachers sat at their own table, talking among themselves. If they noticed, they didn't say a word. Emily began eating faster, hoping to finish before anyone else decided to join in. When the bell rang, she left without looking at anyone. The afternoon dragged on, each class a blur. She doodled in the margins of her notebook, trying to keep her mind somewhere else. But the laughter from lunch still echoed in her ears. After school, she walked home slowly, her shoes scraping the sidewalk. She passed the corner store, the smell of fresh bread spilling out the door. Her stomach growled, but she kept walking. She knew her family couldn't afford extras. Her father had been out of work for months now, searching for jobs that never called back. Her mother worked late shifts at a small diner, coming home with tired eyes and sore feet. Most nights, Emily heard them whispering in the kitchen about bills. Food had become a careful calculation, measured in slices, not servings. When dinner came, it was usually something small and simple. No one complained, but the silence at the table said enough. Emily understood more than her parents realized. She never asked for more food, even when her stomach ached. She had learned to save her hunger for the moments that mattered. At school, she pretended it didn't bother her. She laughed quietly to herself in class, hoping people would forget yesterday's scene. But the truth was, kids remembered more than you wanted them to. By Wednesday, the bread and water jokes had taken on a life of their own. Someone had started calling her Bread Girl. She heard it in the hallway, on the playground, even whispered during math. The name stuck to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Every time she heard it, she felt smaller, as if the air had been pressed out of her chest. She wanted to shout that her family was doing their best, that they weren't lazy or careless, but the words never left her mouth. They stayed locked inside, safe from more laughter. Some days she tried to convince herself it didn't matter. It was just bread, just words, nothing more. But deep down, she knew the whispers had carved little cracks in her heart. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, coloring in her homework. Her mother glanced over, offering a tired smile. "How was school?" she asked gently. Emily paused for a moment, then said, "It was fine." It was easier than telling the truth. Her mother handed her a plate with a small sandwich. Emily took it, forcing a smile, feeling the lump in her throat grow heavier. She didn't cry. She never cried in front of her parents. She ate slowly, thinking of how tomorrow would be the same. And when she went to bed, the echoes of the cafeteria still lingered in her mind. The dark room was quiet, but her thoughts weren't. She told herself, "Just one more day, I can handle this." But deep down, she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending. Thursday arrived with a sky the color of pale grey clouds, the kind that made the morning feel slower than usual. Emily walked into school with her lunchbox tucked firmly under her arm, her steps small and careful. The hallway buzzed with the same voices she had learned to ignore. She went straight to her seat in class, letting the hours pass until the bell rang for lunch. Hen it did. She followed the familiar path to her quiet corner in the cafeteria. The sound of chairs scraping and trays clattering filled the air, but she didn't lift her head. She placed her lunchbox on the table and began opening the latch. Her fingers moved slowly, almost reluctantly. As she peeled back the lid, she heard footsteps stop behind her. Then came a voice, deep and steady. "Is this seat taken?" the man asked. Emily's head shot up, and her breath caught in her chest. Standing there was a tall man in a dark navy suit, his tie perfectly in place. His shoes gleamed under the cafeteria lights, but it wasn't his clothes that struck her. It was the warmth in his eyes. She recognized him instantly. Mr. Grant. He was the man everyone had been talking about all week, the one invited to speak in the school auditorium later that day. Rumor had it he was worth millions, the CEO of a company that made products people used every day. Emily had only seen him in the pictures hanging on the school's notice board. She never imagined he'd be standing in front of her. She glanced around to see if he was talking to someone else, but there was no one behind her. Her voice caught in her throat. Before she could answer, Mr. Grant smiled and slid into the seat across from her. His movements were calm, confident, yet oddly gentle for someone so important. The cafeteria, normally full of noise, seemed to dip into a hush. Students turned in their seats to stare. A teacher paused mid-bite, watching the scene unfold. Emily's heart thudded in her chest, and she wasn't sure if it was fear or surprise. Mr. Grant rested his elbows lightly on the table and looked at her lunchbox. His expression didn't change, no sign of judgment, no flicker of pity. Instead, he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something only he understood. Emily didn't know where to look. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her wax paper. From the corner of her eye, she saw heads turning, whispers beginning to spread. Why was he sitting with her? Why not with the principal or at the front with the staff? The air felt heavier with every passing second, as if the whole room was holding its breath. Emily wanted to ask him why he had chosen her table, but the words stayed trapped in her chest. Mr. Grant glanced around the cafeteria briefly, then back at her. "You don't mind if I eat here, do you?" he asked, his tone light, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She shook her head quickly, her hair falling into her face. He smiled again, the kind of smile that seemed to settle the air around them. From across the room, a boy jabbed his friend in the ribs, pointing at them. A ripple of hushed voices traveled through the tables. Emily could feel every eye in the room on her now, but strangely, the feeling wasn't as sharp as it had been earlier in the week. She took a slow breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Mr. Grant reached into his own sleek leather bag and pulled out a small sandwich wrapped in paper. It wasn't the kind of lunch she imagined someone like him would have. He placed it on the table without unwrapping it yet, his attention still on her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was different from the awkward quiet she was used to. This one felt safe. Emily glanced up just long enough to meet his eyes. They didn't carry the sharp glint of mockery she had seen so often. Instead, there was something softer there, something that made her chest loosen just a little. At the far end of the cafeteria, someone dropped a tray, the loud clang breaking the stillness. But even as the chatter resumed, the moment between them remained untouched. Emily wasn't sure what was going to happen next. She only knew that something about this lunch period already felt different from all the others. Mr. Grant's gaze shifted briefly to her lunchbox, then to the sea of curious faces watching from every direction. "This looks delicious," he eyed warmly, his voice steady enough for nearby tables to hear. Emily blinked, unsure how to respond. From his bag, he pulled out a slice of bread wrapped in paper, setting it gently on the table between them. The gesture was simple, but it drew even more attention. "You know," he began, his tone carrying just enough to reach the farthest corners of the cafeteria, "when I was your age, my lunch looked exactly like this." A few students leaned in from their seats, curiosity replacing smirks. "Bread and water," he continued, nodding toward her bottle. The words hung in the air, touching a silence that felt different from the ones Emily was used to. He glanced back at her, not with pity, but with a knowing look, as though he had lived through this moment himself. "And it taught me something important," he went on, his voice firm but gentle. "Hunger can either break you or make you stronger." A ripple of whispers moved across the room, but this time there was no laughter hidden inside them. Emily sat still, her fingers resting on the edge of the table. Mr. Grant leaned back slightly, his eyes sweeping the room as if to make sure everyone was listening. "When you're young," he said, "it's easy to believe that what's in your hands decides your worth." He tapped the slice of bread lightly, almost like it was a symbol. "But your worth is here," he added, pressing his hand to his chest. A few students shifted uncomfortably, their earlier grins fading. Emily could feel the weight of the moment pressing down in the best way, quiet, focused, and real. Mr. Grant picked up his bread, took a small bite, and chewed slowly, as if it was the finest meal in the world. He nodded approvingly, making it look like he truly enjoyed it. The act felt deliberate, almost like he was teaching without using too many words. Around them, the cafeteria's usual chaos softened into a hum. Students who had been mid-bite paused to watch. Even the teachers glanced over, sensing something unusual was happening. Emily looked at her own bread, seeing it differently now. It wasn't just the only food she had. It was a part of her story. Mr. Grant swallowed his bite and set the bread down carefully. "This lunch," he said, gesturing between them, "reminds me of who I was before the suits, before the offices, before anyone knew my name." The sentence felt heavy with memories, though he didn't explain them yet. A few students in the back exchanged thoughtful looks. Emily noticed that no one was pretending to drink from invisible bottles anymore. Instead, the eyes on her were softer, curious, and maybe even respectful. Mr. Grant's expression stayed calm, but there was something in his gaze that made her believe he understood exactly what it felt like to be her. The silence in the room wasn't awkward now. It was expectant. She realized they were waiting for him to keep speaking. He took another slow sip from his own water bottle, as if to show there was nothing shameful in it. "It's easy to mock what you don't understand," he said finally, his voice steady. "But sometimes, what you don't understand is exactly what could make you stronger than everyone else in the room." Emily's chest tightened, not with embarrassment this time, but with something that felt like hope. Across the cafeteria, a fork clinked against a tray, and the sound seemed startling in the quiet. The moment felt suspended, like a thin thread holding the room together. Mr. Grant didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it breathe, let the meaning sink in. Emily's fingers relaxed on the table, the tension she carried loosening a little more with each second. She caught herself sitting straighter, almost without thinking about it. The bread in front of her no longer looked small. It looked like a piece of something much bigger. Mr. Grant met her gaze again and gave the faintest nod, as if to say she didn't need to explain herself to anyone. For once, she believed him. Mr. Grant's eye swept across the room, holding the attention of every student as if he had been speaking to them all along. He began to share pieces of his past, his voice carrying a steady rhythm that made people lean in. "When I was your age," he said, "my family didn't have much, not even enough for what most people would call a full meal." He paused, letting the truth settle before continuing. "I remember kids laughing at me for what I brought to school. I remember the jokes, the whispers, and I remember how small it made me feel." Emily listened closely, feeling a strange connection to every word. "But here's the thing," he continued. "Those moments, they didn't break me. They built me." The quiet in the cafeteria deepened, as though the walls themselves were listening. "They taught me that the world won't always hand you what you need," he said, his tone firm, "but it will always give you chances to grow stronger." Some students lowered their eyes, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared openly, caught between curiosity and guilt. "My father worked long hours in jobs most people never noticed," Mr. Grant went on. "My mother did everything she could to stretch what little we had into something enough for all of us." Emily thought of her own parents and felt a warmth in her chest. "There were days," he said, "when I thought the hunger would win, but instead, it made me dream bigger." He leaned forward slightly, as if sharing a secret with the entire room. "I decided that one day, I'd make sure I could fill not just my plate, but the plates of others too." A murmur of admiration moved quietly through the cafeteria. Mr. Grant smiled faintly, then added, "Success isn't about what's on your plate." His gaze swept over the tables, landing back on Emily. "It's about what's in your heart." The sentence felt like it wrapped itself around her, warm and certain. She sat a little taller, her hands resting more confidently on the table. Mr. Grant reached for his water bottle and lifted it slightly. The light caught on the plastic, glinting under the fluorescent bulbs. "To strength," he said simply. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it carried more weight than shouting ever could. Emily hesitated for only a moment before reaching for her own bottle. Her fingers curled around it, the cool surface grounding her. When their bottles met with a gentle clink, a ripple seemed to pass through the room. For the first time in days, her lips curved into a real smile. It wasn't a small, uncertain one. It was steady, certain, alive. The boys who had mocked her earlier sat in silence, their expressions unreadable. A few students even smiled faintly in her direction. She took a sip of water, the moment tasting sweeter than any meal she could remember. Mr. Grant set his bottle down and gave her a short nod of approval. It was the kind of gesture that said, "I see you, and I believe in you." Her chest felt lighter, as though some invisible weight had finally been set down. The chatter in the cafeteria began to return, but it carried a different tone now. It was softer, less sharp, almost respectful. Emily glanced around and noticed fewer eyes watching her with judgment. Instead, they seemed to watch her with something closer to understanding. The air didn't feel as heavy anymore. She turned back to Mr. Grant, who was unwrapping his sandwich now. They ate in comfortable silence for a few moments, the noise of the cafeteria becoming just another background hum. Emily realized she wasn't counting the minutes until lunch was over. She was simply living them. She could still feel the echo of his words in her mind, steady and certain. She wondered if this was what it felt like to have someone stand beside you instead of against you. Her smile lingered even as she took another sip of water. Across the room, someone started a quiet conversation and laughter followed, but it wasn't directed at her. The shift was small, almost invisible, but she felt it all the same. Chatul. For the first time in a long while, Emily wasn't shrinking into her seat. She was holding her place at the table, and it felt right. The days that followed felt different for Emily in ways she couldn't fully describe. She noticed that the sharp sting in the air during lunch had faded. Instead of whispers, there were quiet greetings and even a few smiles. Some classmates who once looked past her now offered small nods as she walked by. The boys who had laughed before no longer seemed so eager to point her out. It was as if a silent truce had been drawn, one she hadn't asked for, but quietly welcomed. A week later, a girl from her math class slid a pack of crackers onto her tray without a word. Emily hesitated, then smiled in thanks, feeling the warmth of the gesture. Soon after, another classmate offered her half a cookie. Little by little, the cafeteria became less of a battlefield and more of a place she could breathe in. Mr. Grant didn't disappear after that lunch. Every so often, an envelope with her name would arrive at the school office. Inside would be a book, carefully chosen, with a short handwritten note tucked between the pages. "Keep going," one note read. "You're stronger than you think," said another. Emily kept them all in a small box under her bed, pulling them out on the harder days. They became reminders that someone out there believed in her future. The years moved forward, and so did she. She grew into her studies, finding a love for learning that carried her through long nights and early mornings. Her parents worked tirelessly, still juggling shifts, but they never missed the chance to tell her how proud they were. When college acceptance letters arrived, Emily held one in her hands with trembling fingers, barely able to believe it was real. She stepped onto campus for the first time with the same quiet determination she had carried since that day, in the cafeteria. 4 years later, she stood backstage at her graduation ceremony, her cap in place and her gown draped neatly over her shoulders. Her heart pounded as she listened to the name of the student before her being called. Then it was her turn. She walked onto the stage, the bright lights making it hard to see the faces in the crowd. But there, in the front row, sat Mr. Grant. His hair was touched with more grey now, but his smile was exactly the same, warm, steady, and proud. Her throat tightened at the sight of him. When it was time for her to speak, she stepped up to the podium, the paper in her hand, trembling slightly. She began by thanking her professors, her family, and her friends. But then she paused, looking directly at the man in the front row. "To the man who taught me," she said slowly, her voice carrying through the hall, "that my worth was never measured by my lunchbox. Thank you." Her voice wavered on the last word, but she didn't mind. The audience applauded, some wiping their eyes. Mr. Grant gave a small nod, his eyes glistening under the stage lights. In that moment, Emily felt the years between them collapse into a single thread of connection. She remembered the girl who once sat alone with bread and water, and she realized she wasn't that girl anymore. She was the girl who had stood tall, even when it hurt. The ceremony ended, and the graduates tossed their caps into the air. Emily found Mr. Grant in the crowd afterward, and they hugged like family. No words were needed. The hug said everything. As they pulled back, he placed a small card in her hand. On it was written, "Your story is just beginning." Emily smiled, knowing he was right. The road ahead was uncertain, but she no longer feared it. She had learned that her strength wasn't in the things she carried, it was in the way she carried herself. And no matter where life took her, she would always remember the moment someone chose to sit beside her and see her for who she truly was.